I've been arguing on the internet for 22 years. That was the sentence that came to me when I was pondering why exactly it was I was qualified to give this talk. And I really think that's it. I've been arguing on the internet for 22 years. And I hope that I've gotten a little bit better at it over the time. Before I begin formally, I want to say from the outset what this talk is not. It is not a guide to making money and getting lots of likes on Facebook and follows on Twitter. I am by no means the best at those things, nor am I entirely sure how any meager success I've had in them may have come about. So what this talk is a series of reflections on my own experiences in social media over the course of the past 22 years, 19 of which have been very much involved with orthodoxy online. If I'm going to say something about using social media to promote ministry, then all I can really do is tell you what I happen to do and why I do it. The key thing, I believe, is that when using social media, one is authentic and faithful to the ministry of presence that God has given even in the disincarnate virtual world of the internet. That authenticity and faithfulness may well translate into success, however defined and measured, in using social media for ministry. But more importantly, I hope that it translates into providing a genuine evangelistic witness for the truth of Jesus Christ and his body, the church. A witness that will connect other people with him. So where do we begin? We begin with today. Today is Friday, September 8319th, 1993. I'm sure that probably sounds like nonsense to most of you. To understand why that is today's date, September 8319th, 1993, we need to think back to a time before Snapchat, before Instagram, before Reddit, before Twitter, before Facebook, before MySpace, before Google, before LiveJournal, which is where I met my wife, and even before Yahoo. Let's go back to when the internet was still just emerging from being the hybrid product of a project of the U.S. Department of Defense and the networks that had formed between most major American universities. Back in 1993, hardly anyone had heard of the internet. The World Wide Web had come into existence only 3 years before, with the first website being created in December of 1990. Certainly, there were already national-level BBS sites in operation, such as Prodigy, CompuServe, and America Online. Anyone remember those? Yes. But in 1993, the internet still existed mostly as just what the military had created and called ARPANET, which had been created in 1969, along with university networks. And just for the sake of chronological accuracy, in 1969, Al Gore had just finished his undergraduate studies and probably didn't know that what would become the internet even existed. You may remember that in 1999, he claimed in an interview that during his time in Congress, which did not begin until 1985, he, quote, took the initiative in creating the internet. In the early 1980s, ARPANET expanded its connectivity into places like universities. And the expanded network began being used by academics, giving birth to what we now know as the internet. By 1993, however, most people had still never sent an email, although email had been around since the early 1970s. Yet there nevertheless existed an active social networking community on the internet. That community was called Usenet. Usenet consisted of a series of groups dedicated to different topics. Users could post a text message to one or more groups, which were called news groups, although they often weren't about news. And then that post would get propagated to other sites that each had their own Usenet servers. It was not instantaneous, though it was still pretty fast, and not all of the propagation took place via the internet. Some parts of Usenet's network actually existed through computers calling each other on the telephone in the middle of the night. much like we may remember seeing happen in the 1983 Matthew Broderick film War Games. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but much of Usenet's network actually existed apart from the internet prior to the mid-1980s. Some of it was distributed through the old call-in BBSs, and parts of Usenet were just a repropagation of email lists that existed on ARPANET. And it was all just text. People sometimes posted graphics, but they were mostly drawings made out of the ASCII characters that can be generated by a computer keyboard. Imagine drawing pictures by using a typewriter, and you'll get the idea. They would post text-converted pictures as well, which could be converted back on one's local computer into a regular image file. But those were usually too big to bother with, so it was a world of text. As computers became more popular in university settings, Usenet eventually came to be populated almost entirely by academics and college students. And because those most likely to use computers in those days were those interested specifically in things like computer science, Usenet discussion was initially dominated by the kinds of topics of interest to those people. Over time, Usenet adopted its own sense of social etiquette, which for a little while was called netiquette, and cultural norms, even having its own kind of humor. Science fiction was a major topic of discussion, and quick-witted sarcasm was the norm. And so every September, when a new class of freshmen would come to college and gain Usenet access for the first time through the computer labs at their schools, the news groups would be flooded with a few hundred newbies who did not know how to act. Usenet always braced itself in September, and eventually the freshmen would figure out how to act, often after getting flamed by old-timers on the network, or they would lose interest and leave. But September 1993 was different. In that September, the computer service America Online, AOL, enabled Usenet access for its users. And so, in addition to the few hundred collegiate newbies on Usenet that September, AOL added more than 350,000. And to make things worse, AOL's Usenet software had a glitch in it that posted every post from an AOL user 4 times. Usenet was overrun nearly overnight by newbies who were suddenly in the majority. And even though some of the newbies figured out how to act, AOL's user base kept expanding. By December, AOL had 500,000 users, all with access to Usenet. And so the internet also began expanding into the commercial world at this time. I even remember the first time I saw a web address show up in a movie trailer. And so September 1993 kept going. And thus we are still in what came to be known as the Eternal September, now 8,319 days long, when new people come online oblivious to the social expectations and mores that had been established over decades by a small community in the first major social network. April of 1994 saw the first worldwide spam attack, with the spamming of news groups by a pair of green card lawyers named Lawrence Cantor and Martha Siegel, whose overburdening of the network actually knocked all of Australia off the internet for a time. It's likely that this usage of the word spam came from Usenet, who were quoting a Monty Python sketch, by the way. Usenet itself largely doesn't exist anymore, at least not as it did. And its death essentially occurred when it became the repository for gargantuan amounts of pornographic picture and video files. After that occurred, many Usenet servers were shut down. In 2010, Duke University, where Usenet was born, powered down its new server. But before all that happened, in September of 1994, or rather around September 366th, 1993, I got access to Usenet. I was a college freshman, a newbie. I had graduated from high school a whole year before, sitting out a year between high school and college, and I was beginning my college career at North Carolina State University with every intention of transferring out after a year to go to an art school to study theater. But I'd always liked computers, so it didn't take too long before I found the computer labs on campus. And there were plenty because I happened to be attending one of the best schools for computer science and engineering at the time. And in 1994, the university networks that had previously been open only to engineers came open to people majoring in the humanities, like me. My newbie period probably lasted a few years rather than a few months. I suffered mainly from an acute affliction known to medical science as being a 19-year-old boy. I participated in flame wars. I made a hobby out of trying to make fun of people. I imagined myself to be a kaibologist. Kaibology was a joke religion that made fun of Scientology. Anyone heard of kaibology? That's the way it usually goes. It was big back in the day, I tell you. And I even helped create a knockoff of kaibology local to my friends at NC State. And I did it all quite badly. I didn't realize that at the time, of course. At the time, I thought that I was brilliant. Years later, I was reminiscing with a friend from those days. I said to him, I was nowhere near as funny as I think I thought I was. His reply, it's okay, Father Andrew. Nobody in the history of the world has ever been as funny as you thought you were. And I'm still in recovery. But from those bizarre few years of learning online social interaction on Usenet, I learned the basics of how to endure a flame war and how to give as good as I got. And I also picked up some obscure humor that my wife still doesn't find funny. But in that same period, in the fall of 1997, I first learned about the Orthodox Church. And I first started reading about it on the internet. And when I chose to become Orthodox, I slowly began to realize that my way of dealing with people online had to change. Because I wasn't funny, and because I was a jerk. And because Orthodox theology helps us to see that even in a disincarnate virtual world, we incarnate real people who believe in an incarnate God have to behave in certain kinds of ways online. So virtual life really is real life. Part of real life, anyway. When I first started reading about Orthodoxy in 1997, I did so primarily through the internet. At the time, you could read nearly everything that was online about Orthodoxy in the space of roughly 3 weeks. And I did. Back in 1997, there weren't very many Orthodox websites. I don't remember any parishes having websites at all. There were a couple of websites dedicated to OCFs at universities, which made sense since the web was still focused on universities in those days. There was the St. Pachomius Library. Anyone seen that? It's still around, which is a repository of mostly patristic texts. In addition to those websites, there were also a few email groups where Orthodoxy was discussed. The Orthodox Forum, what was called the Indiana List, since it was hosted by a server at Indiana University, and a couple of groups dedicated to discussions between Orthodox Christians and evangelicals. One thing that was true in 1997 of Orthodoxy online was that most of the people writing about it were at least moderately well educated in the faith. If you asked a question on one of those email lists, you probably got a pretty correct answer. But here in 2016, things are quite different. If you do a Google search for the phrase Orthodox Church, something you couldn't do in 1997, although you could search through Alta Vista, which is what I did, or for the true deep nerds among you, Archie. Anyone use Archie? I see a couple of nods. You are a deep nerd, young lady. That's good. If you do a Google search for the phrase Orthodox Church now, there are now more than 21 million results. Facebook alone has more than 500,000 publicly searchable references to Orthodoxy, to say nothing of probably the multiple of that that are not publicly searchable. So things have changed in the past 19 years. Much of it is for the better, but it's also become much more confusing. How is the average inquirer into orthodoxy supposed to know, for instance, that the evangelical Orthodox Catholic Church he finds near his home via Google is not actually part of the Orthodox Church? That may be relatively easy to overcome eventually, of course, but what about the nearly 11,000 members of the Ask an Orthodox Priest group on Facebook who ask questions and mostly get answers from anyone except Orthodox priests? If you don't know anything about Orthodox theology and practice and live in an online bubble where everyone is telling you one thing and yet you see another when you visit a local parish, what are you supposed to do? And how do you choose between people who are arguing with each other? So there is a lot of pooling of ignorance going on the Orthodox internet. Orthodoxy online is often its own thing that in many cases may bear little resemblance to orthodoxy on the ground in actual parish life. Relatively minor controversies can look pretty big online. Depending on which set of blogs and Facebook groups you read, you might get the impression that there is a huge influx of converts into orthodoxy, that there is a huge outflux of ex-converts out of orthodoxy, that rigorist old calendarists in resistance are a major force in the Orthodox Church, that multiple competing ethnic jurisdictions is the norm, that aerial toll houses are being discussed at coffee hour worldwide, that no one in Orthodox churches in America speaks any English, that Western Rite Orthodoxy is a big presence in Orthodoxy, that Orthodox bishops are constantly committing big transgressions, and so on. Yet just about none of that is actually true. The reality is that most of the things that online seem like a big deal are actually pretty minor. That parish life mostly just goes along fairly peacefully, and that most of the people and clergy in the Orthodox Church are pretty normal, not particularly saintly, nor particularly wicked. There are times, of course, when someone can have an unusual parish experience that can get mitigated online. A newcomer who is the wrong racial color who steps into a parish might get given the cold shoulder and figure that all Orthodox churches are that way. And he might possibly go online and ask about this and be reassured that not all Orthodoxy is that way. But he could just as easily be assured that Orthodox Christians really are ethnocentric racists. It can go either way. And it's not just a problem in forums and chat rooms either. There are official-looking question and answer sites that claim to explain what the Orthodox Church teaches and yet make errors, sometimes even big ones. Sometimes those errors are out of ignorance, and sometimes they are sectarian biases coming through without being explicitly identified. Someone who says, for instance, that there are really very few differences between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism may just not know the differences, or may instead be coming from a certain kind of Roman Catholic viewpoint that teaches that Orthodoxy's only real problem is that it doesn't accept papal supremacy. In 1992, one of the major figures in Usenet culture at the time, Dr. Gene Spafford, Spaff is what everyone called him, a professor of computer science at Purdue University, described the culture of Usenet like this, and this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. Usenet is like a herd of performing elephants with diarrhea. Massive, difficult to redirect, awe-inspiring, entertaining, and a source of mind-boggling amounts of excrement when you least expect it. Usenet was awesome, y'all. I'm sorry that if you weren't on it, you missed something fantastic. I imagine that if Spaff were to comment on social media nearly 25 years later, he would probably say roughly the same thing. And orthodoxy in social media is often no exception. This is not to say that everything that is posted online about orthodoxy is bad, or even mostly bad, but without a knowledgeable guide to help you sort through the true, the false, and the merely opinionated, internet orthodoxy can be bewildering. There is nevertheless a lot of good material online about orthodoxy. Most often, parish websites and official diocesan and archdiocesan websites will have pretty reliable stuff on them. There are some excellent weblogs out there too, but there are also some really terrible ones. And some aren't so much terrible as just ignorant or underdeveloped. An inquirer or catechumen might keep a blog exploring Orthodox theology as he works out what it all means. And someone might stumble upon it and not realize that this is really just a beginner figuring things out for himself out loud, so to speak. And there are some Orthodox writers online, even people with impressive academic or ecclesiastical credentials, who are leading people astray. When you see a PhD after someone's name, or see a kindly-looking old man in a cassock and white beard, perhaps even wearing the robes of a bishop, how do you know whether he really knows what he is talking about, whether he has some unorthodox agenda, whether he's saying something controversial, whether he's going out on a limb, whether he's even an Orthodox Christian? Let's face it, it's hard to know unless you've been around for a while and been grounded in normal Orthodox life, and in some cases done some serious theological study. In addition to the problem of finding it difficult to sift through everything online that goes by the name of orthodoxy, there is another problem I'd like to point out, and that's what we might call the online spiritual father. This phenomenon is particularly problematic for those whose ministry online includes the priesthood, but it's also a problem for those who interact with clergy online. Perhaps the most obvious temptation here is for someone to latch on to a clergyman from far away who gives spiritual counsel to someone whom he doesn't know in person. This happens regularly, especially with clergy who may not have the day-to-day demands of running an active parish. I've actually noticed that some of the most active online spiritual fathers are those who are not responsible for a real parish. It is like any long-distance relationship, though, in that it is fraught with possibilities of deception and dishonesty, although usually not intentionally. I was once approached by a young woman whom I had been friends with for some years, mostly through the internet, though I had met her a few times in person, who asked me to be her spiritual father. I was a newly ordained priest at the time and was flattered. I considered the idea for a while, rationalizing that we were already friends and so forth, and it made sense. But a warning kept sounding in my heart, especially because she was an attractive young woman. And I knew that even if there were no sin being pursued, there was a potential for scandal. There are too many problems with the long-distance spiritual father, and the illusory intimacy of the internet does not fix them. Part of the problem is that folks who are exploring orthodoxy, whether they are new converts or just trying to be more serious, may read that there is a necessity for something called a spiritual father, to whom one must be obedient if one wants to be saved and authentically orthodox. And so they go looking for one. Or they expect every Orthodox person they meet to have one. But for most people, your local parish priest is the one responsible to help guide you in the spiritual life, whether you call him a spiritual father or not. But perhaps more importantly, only very few priests are actually given the spiritual gift of being able to direct people in that level of obedience where they really could be consulted on almost everything. Most priests cannot do that, and most people don't need that. Most priests don't have that kind of gift. I do not. We're trained to give spiritual advice, to see where problems pop up, and to help direct people in the right path, doing normal spiritual things that are normal for just about everyone in the church. But almost none of us is a true spiritual father in the Russian sense of the starets or the Greek yeronda, who is someone with a special charisma from God to direct people's lives in a very hands-on way, micromanaging the spiritual life. For that reason, I don't use the phrase spiritual father for myself. I will only say father confessor or just confessor. And I never tell anyone that they have to be obedient to me. The only time I give commands to people is in very serious situations, such as adultery or something like that. And the command is usually something along the lines of, stop it right now. And I've got a hard and fast rule that I never do that stuff over the internet with people I don't know. Never. I sometimes get requests from people who have seen some of my writing or listened to podcasts who ask for an open-ended spiritual relationship where they can come back to me again and again with questions and concerns in exploring orthodoxy. I can always tell when this is about to happen because I get an email or a Facebook message saying, do you mind if I come to you with some questions? I tell them that I'm willing to answer quick questions, but that I only enter into long-term private theological and spiritual discussions with people whom I already know or who are members or potential members of my parish. I even have a little form letter I've put together for this purpose. The main reason is that spiritual fatherhood over the internet is dangerous. I also explain to people that I just don't have the time to take care of the people whom I've been given at my parish and everyone else who writes to me. And I'm thankful that the official clergy guide published by my archdiocese stipulates that confession is not to be conducted over the telephone or email. I am, however, thankful that even though there is a problem with people not just approaching individual clergy for spiritual guidance, but also with posting very personal spiritual questions and concerns to internet forums, there has come to be a culture of orthodoxy online that repeats one 3-word refrain over and over. Ask your priest. I love that. Just about every post along these lines eventually gets responded to by someone saying, ask your priest. I think we should underline the word your. Maybe ask your own priest, It's a good thing. So here I would like to make one of my most central points. Orthodoxy is an incarnate faith. It does not exist apart from real worshiping community, whether that community is a parish or a monastery. We'll come back to that again, but here we should note that even though life online is indeed real, with real consequences, real interactions, and so forth, because it is disembodied, it is in some sense less real than the relationships that come from people being in each other's physical presence. It's still real, but it can tend toward delusion. This delusion is especially a temptation for those who do a lot of interacting online as part of their ministry. We want to be accessible, yet we are unqualified to give guidance to others through social media except in the most general sense. The key to keeping grounded is that wonderful 3-word phrase, ask your priest. We always refer back to the incarnate so that we can avoid delusion. This is something Orthodoxy knows quite well, and its holy mysteries are a testament to that. One cannot receive the Eucharist through the internet. One cannot sing at liturgy through the internet. Although I'm imagining what that might look like technologically, and I just hate it. Or you can't stand in the presence of God as you do in church, or receive the other mysteries through the internet. It just doesn't work. So what that means in practice is that while we can engage in interactions relevant to the faith online, pride of place has to be given to normal parish life. Given all of these complications, is it actually worth it to bother with social media? I know Orthodox Christians, including clergy, who wants nothing to do with it. I know those who have a ministry but see making it available online as somehow wrong or cheap. There are clergy who tell their parishioners to stay away from internet forums. There were even guidelines published by one Orthodox jurisdiction limiting the involvement of clergy in social media and telling them, for instance, that they have to unfriend everyone from former parishes, or that they should never send a friend request to someone whom they minister to. There are people who believe it unseemly for clergy to be on social media at all. And there are some clergy who are convinced that in the whole internet itself, you'll never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. That's for you Star Wars fans. And then there's the halfway approach to this question. On Forgiveness Sunday, followed by public requests for forgiveness on Facebook and elsewhere, many Orthodox Christians often announce that they will be taking a break from social media during Great Lent. And I know one priest who occasionally took these breaks who eventually made it permanent after his wife told him that she found him more likable when he wasn't engaged with Facebook. Although he's back now, actually. Which is good. To be honest, though, these announcements where people ask the whole world for forgiveness via social media, they strike me as artificial. I have no doubt that the hearts of those who make these public announcements are in the right place. But there is, to my sensibility, something unseemly about this. Forgiveness Vespers is a real church service which concludes with the rite of forgiveness, but to remove that asking for forgiveness from the rite and simply put it out there for the world, at least seems to me something more like celebrity or political repentance. You know, when famous people get up and say, I apologize. I take responsibility. Although they take no consequences usually. It is an announcement rather than an encounter. You see the difference? It is an announcement rather than an encounter. One is never really sure that it's meant seriously, and asking for forgiveness from Facebook on Forgiveness Sunday can come off rather like a kind of holiday greeting. It's just what you're supposed to say on that day. Now, I don't hold this online Forgiveness Vespers against anyone, but it feels to me like it cheapens the whole thing. I won't chastise anyone for it, though, but I don't like it. What this particular issue underlines is that there are both good and bad ways to be Orthodox in social media. And since it is clear that Orthodox Christians are not going to exit social media and the rest of the internet en masse anytime soon, those ministering to Orthodox Christians and to those we'd like to become Orthodox Christians, we have to be there. So I'd like to say a few things about the kinds of choices that I make when I try to witness and live the faith online. I was once asked about the personal filter I use when posting things online, both in terms of what I share and how I comment. And so I'll say a few things about that, noting that what I choose to do may not be what you choose to do. And certainly it is different when I am presented online as a priest and I post something than when a layman posts something. And if I may also say so, it is again different in another way if a bishop posts something. And I must admit that I'm always a little bemused and slightly baffled when I see a monk with a Facebook account. I will get over that, though. All that said, the laity in some ways have a better opportunity to witness the faith in public spaces like social media than the clergy do. People expect certain things from clergy and may dismiss what they say because they are just doing their job or may be seen as having a vested interest in what they are presenting. A layman who talks about his faith online, however, is less likely to be seen as pushing an agenda. All that said, I try to follow certain general principles when I post and engage in discussions on social media. Some of these principles I came to by learning from others, and some I came to because I made mistakes and had to set some rules for myself. My most basic rule is that I never post anything anywhere that I would be horrified to find forwarded around beyond my control. I use privacy filters to limit exposure on certain posts for various reasons, but even with those filters in place, I still try to imagine someone passing it on where I didn't intend it to be. When something goes online, even email, it can potentially get away from you. Email and other private messaging are usually more private, but you never really know when something you write could get passed on without your knowing it. And of course, these days, we never know when the NSA might be watching. Another rule I set for myself is that I try to limit posts about partisan politics. It's not that I don't have strong political opinions. I do. And isn't this a great year to have political opinions? But even if I vote for candidates from a particular party, I don't want to be seen as on their team, if only because no political party truly represents what the Orthodox Church teaches. That's not to say that I'm not ready to criticize political leaders when they do wrong. There is a long tradition of that in Orthodoxy. But in general, I find that political postings can dilute my ability to witness to the faith, if only because they will turn off a big portion of my readers. When I do talk about politics, I usually do so in specifically moral and philosophical terms, and I have no problem criticizing politicians from all parties. As far as presidents go, I haven't been a true fan of any who have served in the whole time that I have been alive. It's probably best not to be a fan of any politician, to be honest, even if he or she is genuinely virtuous. We have plenty of real heroes available to us in the saints. So even though I do post about politics, I try not to be too political, especially around elections, when things can get so polarized. Politics can be a real turnoff for many people, and if I post frequently about political matters, then I am almost certainly alienating some folks. But when witnessing the gospel online, I want to witness it to both Democrats and Republicans, as well as independents, libertarians, Green Partiers, Tea Partiers, conservatives, liberals, localists, socialists, and so on. Everyone needs to hear the gospel. And if I fill my social media posts with a lot of politics, I am almost certainly cutting some people off from learning the gospel from me. I think this also applies to issues pertaining to what is called the culture wars, things like abortion and homosexuality. Yes, we need to speak out on those things and even call politicians to account. But we also have to do it intelligently and not just berate people who believe differently. There's so much nastiness that goes around on those things that a different approach has to be offered. And I think that posting constantly about only a couple of things like this essentially just preaches to the choir. You might be taking a stand, but the only people who will see you standing are those who are already standing with you. In that context, speaking out is merely a signal of which team you're on. So while I'm fine with talking about current events, I think that Orthodox Christians, especially clergy, need to be seen as being somewhat beyond the world's temporal entanglements. We have an eternal perspective. And while it is important that we witness the gospel to the world at this very moment in history, we cannot hitch our wagon to the world nor pledge our loyalty to any of the world's parties or movements. Now, none of this is to say that I never post anything controversial. So another rule I have for myself is that if I am going to post something controversial, I will either post it without comment and without engaging any conversation that might follow, letting commenters duke it out amongst themselves, or I will be prepared to enter into the discussion. And if I am going to enter into the discussion and even argue the point, I have to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. And I have to make sure that if I'm sharing an article that the author knows what he's talking about too. Or I need to be ready to critique him. If I'm not ready for all that, I should not comment or maybe shouldn't post it at all. Or if I really feel the need to post that stuff, I should probably mainly do it in groups where it's the main topic. I should also be ready to be criticized myself, even by name. If I put something out there with my name on it, then I need to be thick-skinned enough to take whatever comes in response. As the saying goes, if you want to start a fight on the internet, all you have to do is post your opinion. The best way to grow that thick skin is to know who I am and what I believe, and that those who criticize me, even if they are really outright nasty about it, are not a threat to me. They're not a threat to me. As that sermon title from St. John Chrysostom goes, no one can harm the man who does not harm himself. The whole sermon is right there in the title. Related to that, though, is another practice I have. I'm never afraid to block someone. I'm just not bound by being polite, I guess. If someone just can't seem to behave himself when commenting on things I post or in sending me private messages, I will block him. If it's someone I know personally, then I may calmly explain to him privately why I'm blocking him, perhaps letting him know that I have too many temptations to sin when he posts. I may also give a tactful warning before I block someone, but I don't hesitate to do it. No one needs pointless agitation in his life, whether it is what agitates me or other readers. It's just not worth it. Although, of course, we should note that if it agitates me, then that means I have something I need to repent of. Right? No one can harm the man who does not harm himself. Sometimes it's the best thing for an in-person friendship that the friends don't interact online. I have friends I like in person who really irritate me on the internet. Anyone have that experience? Something else I try to do on social media is simply to be myself. That may sound kind of lame as a rule, but here's what I mean. I don't regard social media as purely for the purpose of pushing religion, so to speak. And if all I ever post is explicitly about the ministry I'm doing, then pushing religion is exactly how I will come across. So I post about Star Trek. I post about my aquarium fish. Actually, I had someone who's coming to this conference who asked if she could consult with me about fish. It's true. I post about things I think are funny. I post about Renaissance poetry. I post music videos. I even sometimes post remarks about the antics of celebrities. And of course, I post about hobbits and elves. I do that for two reasons. The more obvious is that I'm not just using social media as a way to talk about orthodoxy. It's also, well, social for me. I should get to do Facebook. I have real friends there. And as a human person, explicitly religious topics are not the only things I talk about. But the second reason I post about these things is because I want people to learn about orthodoxy. And here's how that works. If all I ever post is exclusively and explicitly about the Orthodox faith, I will essentially be seen as representing an institution, a brand, and not as an accessible, approachable person. But I want to be accessible and approachable, not just for my own salvation, but also because I want people to know about the Orthodox Christian faith. So, interacting on multiple subjects helps to develop an atmosphere of familiarity and relationship. Doesn't the same hold true with relationships you have in the three-dimensional world? If the only thing you ever talk about with someone is your faith, they may see you as trying to sell something. But if there are other facets to the relationship, then they may well be more open to you when you do want to talk about the faith. Now, I do share things that are spiritually uplifting. Not just inspiring photographs with inspiring quotations, some of which are referred to by a friend of mine who doesn't like them as Patrista memes. That's good, isn't it? Yeah. But I also share good pieces of writing and even cultural criticism. It doesn't all have to be from Orthodox sources either. If it's true, then it's true. It's not like every single person outside the canonical boundaries of the Orthodox Church has only unmitigated lies and demonic passions to offer. And sharing things from non-Orthodox voices can also show that Orthodoxy genuinely is open to truth wherever it is found. When I share a piece of cultural commentary from Christianity Today, the magazine, it doesn't mean I'm endorsing everything there, and the thing about sharing links on social media is that most people won't make that assumption either. In fact, relatively few people actually care much about the source for a particular article. Content, as they say, is king. Another rule that I follow is that while I will post links to things that I've written or recorded to help promote them, I don't do it constantly. The vast majority of my posts are about things other than my own work. No one likes an incessant self-promoter. Related to that is that I don't post anything too personal or emotionally charged, either about myself or my family. That kind of stuff stays between me and my confessor, between me and my wife, between me and my close friends. The world, especially not the internet world, is not my psychologist or my confessor. And it is emotionally toxic for me to post publicly on the internet in search of affirmation or sympathy. Such affirmation can feel good, but it can also be delusional and addiction used as a substitute for the in-person relationships that I need to develop. I've seen a number of popular writers online whose interactions with their readers look very much like an addiction, sometimes a mutual one. Trying to follow these rules does not mean that everyone will like me. For one thing, my personality just rubs some people the wrong way. That's how it is for everyone, though, right? And I'm still a sinner. And sometimes people will point that out for me. I've gotten some truly nasty email and comments over the years. I've even had one short post that I made draw 5 different exercised public blog responses over several months from the same person. So I always try to be prepared for hate mail. It's just how it goes. And I also try to listen to criticism and ask what I need to do to repent. Because I do need to repent. And that's one of the reasons why I try to follow these rules that I've made for myself. But even on good days, when I follow my rules closely, I still sometimes get sucked into drawn-out arguments and discussions. And that may be when my wife reminds me of that popular online comic, it's called XKCD, that shows a man bent over his computer. His wife is in the other room, and she says, "Are you coming to bed?" He responds, "I can't, this is important." She says, "What?" And then he says, "Someone is wrong on the internet." Sometimes I'm that guy. Don't be that guy. Especially don't be that guy when you're using social media under something other than your own name. It just looks silly when a Facebook page named for a blog title is getting into a flame war with some cranky commenter. One more rule. Know when to turn it off. Like right now. Are any of you on your phones? All right. All of this emphasizes the difficulty of trying to incorporate social media into the spiritual life and ministry. And notice that I did not say incorporate the spiritual life and ministry into social media. The latter is what I think most often happens, actually. The norms and shape of social media often shape people's spiritual lives, rather than being shaped by spiritual life. This is a big danger, too. Social media is so fractured and chaotic that trying to be an Orthodox Christian in the midst of all can be quite the struggle, especially if one is trying to do ministry. And the struggle is made even greater by the fact that most people who use social media are actually on it more than they are in church or in private prayer. So what shapes the context in which they encounter Orthodox spiritual images and writings the most often is social media, not the church, or the prayer corner, or the everyday experiences of three-dimensional life. In other words, active Orthodox Christians are exposed to orthodoxy more on the internet than they are in church or in prayer. That's sobering. This is why there is so much distortion online of what orthodoxy actually is, because of the way the information is presented to us. With all that in mind, I can fully understand why many clergy and other Orthodox Christians say that social media should just be avoided, that it's a bad place to do ministry, or at least that you shouldn't use it to discuss or learn about the faith. Whenever I begin to think those thoughts, though, I remember why I started using Facebook, the world's most popular social media site, in the first place. I got on Facebook in 2007, shortly after I was assigned to my first parish. The reason I created a Facebook account was so that I could get to know some of my wife's relatives who live overseas. This is the reason many people get into social media, to connect with people who are far away. And having lived in 23 different homes, in 15 different towns, spread across 6 U.S. states and the island of Guam, I have a lot of people I'd like to stay in touch with who are far away. But something I noticed shortly after I got onto Facebook was that there were parishioners from my church there, and they were interacting with each other. The church where I served had nearly 450 families, and a lot of those people were on Facebook. Here was a real opportunity to connect with them every single day in a non-intrusive, informal way. So to those who say that a good Orthodox Christian should have nothing to do with social media, especially those who are clergy, I respond this way. Your parishioners are there, and they're not getting off it. And if you're doing ministry, the people who need you are there, and they're not getting off it. Those who need the Orthodox faith are there, and there is a potent opportunity to connect with them that you may not get any other way. And since there is nothing inherently sinful with using social media, I believe that not only should we not avoid it, but that it is precisely an opportunity for us to share the gospel. Yes, it is incomplete. Yes, it is fractured. Yes, it is often distorted. But those things are true in every other venue when we share the gospel. And so I believe that the presence of Orthodox Christians on social media is actually an opportunity for us to go into all the world to preach the gospel. And I also believe that it's an opportunity for us to be in the world while also not of the world. It's not only a way to share the gospel with those who have never heard it, but also to share it with those who need to hear it more, with those who need some support in it, and with those who may need to be reminded that Christian life is not only for Sunday morning. The opportunity for ministry on social media became clearest to me on the occasion that I was once invited to a Facebook group. This was several years ago, and the group doesn't exist anymore. But the name of the group was this: Don't write anything bad on my wall because my priest has Facebook. Even under that humorous title, the people who started the group were conscious of the presence of their priest and sought to change their behavior and reputation online because they knew that he was there. And now there are thousands of Orthodox clergy on social media, including Facebook, which itself is used by more than 60 canonical Orthodox bishops. There are more than 60 bishops on Facebook. If you're interested in the list for that, you need to go to a Facebook page called Hyperdox Herman. I didn't make that up. So that tells me that it's worth it to pursue holiness online, even to do it in that most democratized, chaotic, unpredictable world of social media. It's never a substitute for the incarnate, in-person spiritual life, but it can be a supplement. If there's one major rule I try to follow above all others, especially when posting online about the Orthodox faith, it's that I ultimately want to direct people to real engagement in a real parish. Even though we do live online in the eternal September, where it seems that anything goes and there are almost no rules, we can be a light in the darkness. And if we do that, then social media can be a blessing and not a curse. It can become an opportunity for us to bring Christ to a world that needs him more all the time. Thank you very much. Before we do Q&A, I just wanted to add one extra reflection, if you don't mind. And that is this. I was once asked the question, and I was really happy that somebody asked me this. So in some sense, I'm providing you with the first question. And the question went something like this. How is orthodoxy well positioned to reach the world within the context of how people receive information now? If you think about the way that especially social media gives us information, right? It is not linear. It does not say, now here is the beginning, the basics, the fundamentals, and now we will build on that, and then build on that and create a full structure, right? That's sort of classic educational theory. But that's not the way that people receive information through social media. And increasingly, it's not the way that most people receive information everywhere in life. Think about, for instance, how you learn about some kind of advertised product. You never receive the basics first. It's images coming at you from multiple vectors, right? And that's how social media works. There's nothing linear about it. Even if you have a news feed that seems to be a line or something like that, it's still multiple vectors, right? Which makes it really tough to deal with pedagogically. It's hard to teach, when that's the way that things go. But orthodoxy actually is well positioned to deal with this. Not just in terms of our interaction online, right? But if you think about the way that you receive what you receive when you go into an Orthodox church, right? When you step in the door, you are not presented with the basics or some kind of foundational principle that then everything is stacked up on top of that moves in a nice linear fashion. No, when you walk into a traditional Orthodox church, you are being attacked from every single direction by a different kind of image that are not necessarily in any clear order. Right? And even especially the Byzantine liturgy, right? Not as much so much with the Western Latin liturgy, but certainly the Byzantine liturgy is so completely nonlinear, and there's numerous layers that are within it that come from its many centuries of development. And so again, it's not clear where the beginning and the end exactly are unless you happen to know sort of the code phrases. And it's also not clear that there's any obvious linear development going on in there. So orthodoxy actually already functions in this multi-vectored way, and has for many, many centuries. The question is, why does it do that? It's not because we didn't invent that, to deal with the modern world of information consumption. We've been doing this for centuries. Rather, what's happening is that what we see in social media, the kind of order that it has created on its own, is essentially the way that human beings naturally tends to function in terms of information. That's the way that we live our lives, right? You don't sit down with your family and say, okay, now everyone today, first we're going to discuss nutrition, and from that we're going to build on that what our meals are going to be, or first we're going to talk about the necessity for you to go to school. All right, this is what school is all about. Now this is why we're going. This is what you're going to be learning today, and now you will go. We don't function that way. We're multi-vectored in the way that we live our lives. This is humanity. So of course Orthodox worship reflects that already. What's fascinating, and so therefore social media does the same thing, because it's a spontaneous creation of order, just throwing a whole bunch of humans together and allowing them to do whatever the heck they want, right? So I think we're well positioned actually to be able to deal with this new uncovering of the way that human beings receive information. It's an uncovering because it's really natural to us, but we're just sort of relearning it as a culture. We're well positioned to deal with that in a way that many other churches and religions simply are not, because they were based on Enlightenment rational principles of linearity. Now that might be a little bit too heady for some of us, but just to boil it down, I would say that orthodoxy is when people walk in the door, they don't need to understand everything. They don't need to understand everything. Yes, we need to teach them, but we shouldn't worry that when they walk in the door, we have to explain every single thing that they see and hear, because this is the way that life functions anyway. We just gradually accumulate our knowledge through this process of receiving things in a multi-vectored way. Anyway, I think that might be interesting to you people, especially who are in ancient faith. I think it's a really interesting philosophical side of where we're going. But all those who are doing ministry, whether it's online or some other way, So anyway, just an observation. I wanted to supply the first question, if you don't mind. All right, next.
All right, just a reminder that if you do have a question, go as Melissa Nasco is doing. She's the author of Fasting as a Family, published by Ancient Faith Publishing. Please come to the microphone. And also, as you're listening to the answers, don't stare deeply into the carpet because the lines start to move. Just don't.
Astigmatism, don't even go there.
Good pro tip. Yes, Father, I was thinking about what you said about the cheapness of having all the services sort of online and the pictures of altar boys doing selfies when the bishop comes and things like that, which, yeah, I've seen, but anyway, so I get that, but then I think there's a flip side of it. So we live in a really small, rural, isolated parish, and we have a parishioner who's dying of congestive heart failure. And when Bishop Peter came through, they went to her house, they gave her a blessing, and they brought her Holy Communion, and that was great. And then we had the curse root icon recently, and the priest brought it to her house, but she can't leave her home right now. She's in home hospice. So the flip side of it is that our parish has a 24-hour webcam that you can view online, and you can. So I can be cleaning the floor. My mom can see it in Denver, but the flip side of it is that she tells me, I sang the tropar with you guys today, and when the curse group icon was there, and we had vespers, she was singing, and it's kind of weird because I can see the negative effects that the invasion of the internet and social media has on the liturgical life. But I also see Linda at her house watching all of us on the internet. And interestingly enough, and I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing, my youngest kids know that she's at home watching because we talked to her on the phone. And they will literally jump out and wave at the camera at random points. They're like, ah! And I'll hear about it later that, she's like, oh, and I saw Claudia wave to me. So I don't know. There's a push and a pull. And I think done properly with the right perspective, that pull can be a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not against streaming services or any of that sort of thing. My only concern is when those things become a substitute. And we have to remember that in the context of there is a whole world of people who go to church on Sunday by simply watching certain things on television. Or now, through the internet. There are online churches now where you sit home and do that. So that's what I'm talking about, especially where you're talking about an extraordinary circumstance where someone cannot come to church for whatever reason. Absolutely, I think it's good to have streaming services online so they can connect and participate as best they can. But we should not sort of codify that into being the norm. The norm is that we are there, that we are physically there and can see each other and hear each other and smell each other, and that's how you know you're near another human being, and truly receive the sacraments and so forth. So yeah, I'm perfectly happy with a wired church, so to speak, as long as it doesn't become a substitute for people, and certainly doesn't become the focus of what you're doing. I say all that having come from within the context. I didn't mention this, but my upbringing was as the son of evangelical missionaries, and not just evangelical missionaries, but evangelical radio missionaries. So there's a whole set of issues of what it means to be doing gospel preaching and evangelism and so forth in a completely disincarnate, disembodied situation. So there is a tension there that just cannot be escaped. It cannot be escaped. So, hope that's helpful.
Okay, hi. I've got a couple questions, and they're related. And I want your feedback on that. First, one of my favorite podcasters, his name is Merlin Mann. He has a way, his opinion is, his saying is, when people are saying something that kind of is inflammatory or responding to a podcast or a blog, he just says, sorry, I do not argue on the internet. And that just shuts everything down. And so I'm thinking about that, and if that's just a proper response all the time. But also, when I'm thinking about blogging, the topic, the people I'm thinking about, they're a group of folks that are great, and there's a lot of different opinions and strongly felt. And giving voice to these folks, there's going to be there could be, I know there's a huge potential of a lot of rough comments and feelings and thoughts that naturally would probably be aired. And so I guess my question is this even the safe thing to engage in? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, are those both your questions, or is that one question?
That's both questions.
That's both questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So, with regards to your first question as to, I do not argue on the internet. I argue on the internet. I'm sure one or two of you might see me doing it somewhere. I argue on the internet. But there is a good way to do it and there's a bad way to do it. And I've done both. The bad way of arguing on the internet is when you begin to ascribe your own self-worth to what other people say. The reality is that who we are comes from God, and part of what it means to pursue the spiritual life is a process of self-knowledge, which means knowing God, right? And when someone is really pursuing that and actually knowing God, and therefore also getting to know themselves, then when someone else fails to supply that affirmation that I crave because I'm addicted to it, which we all tend to be, right? We're addicted to affirmation. When someone has that addiction and then they're not getting it, then that motivates them to be cranky in response, right? Because what happens is I have handed over my identity to another person, and I don't like what they're doing with it, so I'm going to attack them back. Right? That's what happens. And so you notice, you can see this in online discussions that go south. It becomes personal really quickly. Why? Because the person came into it with it being a personal thing. Now, if you go into it with a sense of, look, I know who I am and what I'm about, and my sense of myself does not depend on another person, then, but depends only on God, then that means that even if they blast you back in return, you can kind of go, oh, I observe your dysfunction. Oh, you must be hurting. I'm going to pray for you. You don't have to say that stuff to them because that could be very inflammatory itself. But you can at least kind of know, when someone responds to you in that way, not just on the internet, but in person, then what you should be hearing is, I'm hurting. Hurt people, right? Hurt people. And so when think about when you yourself are being nasty to another person, you're having anger, whatever. It's because you hurt. It's because you're hurting. So that's who we are as part of our spiritual journey. And so the bad way to engage in arguing on the internet or discussions, however you want to call it, is to invest your sense of identity in what's going on. And that's a quick path to a real flame war. I kind of miss that phrase, flame war. We used to use that a lot on Usenet, but it seems to be gone now. Because it's so, what's a beautiful illustration, like two people with flamethrowers, So there are some days when I would certainly respond as that podcast you mentioned, I don't argue on the internet. I might say, I'm not arguing today. Which might be accompanied with, look, I don't have the time to do this today. If you'd like to argue, we can maybe do this tomorrow, or whatever it might be, and that kind of answers both your questions. I mean, it can be safe, but you have to go in with your armor, and the armor is not trying to be tough or whatever. The armor is actually about prayer and knowing God and knowing yourself and becoming, as my confessor once said to me, he said, there was that book that self-help book in the 60s and 70s called I'm Okay, You're Okay. Everybody heard of that? I'm Okay, You're Okay. He says, in Orthodoxy, it's not I'm okay, you're okay. It's I'm not okay, you're not okay, but that's okay. And I find the more that I sort of try to do my interactions that way, not just on the internet, but with my family and my parishioners, it's okay. It works so much better that way. And you can go into it with joy, and your heart actually can be softened towards people who are telling you, I'm hurting. That's not the words they're using. They're usually saying things like, how could you possibly say such a thing, etc. So I hope that helps. Yeah, Father.
Thank you, Father. And sorry, I'm just going to crouch down.
It's a very tough cross to bear, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Just kidding.
We share the cross together. There's an interesting video that was circulating on YouTube a few years ago called "The Innovation of Loneliness." I don't know if you've seen it.
Say that again?
The Innovation of Loneliness.
Loneliness?
Yeah, it's not an Orthodox video, but it basically just speaks about people's interaction with social media. And I'm all for social media, obviously. But
We just became friends on Facebook today.
we didn't even, even though,
Because I have a rule, if I don't know you,
that's right.
I don't return that friend request. But
That's
I
right.
know
You
Father
never did in
did.
the past, and I was wondering. I didn't feel bad because I knew what he was doing because he's mentioned it before. But basically, the video, the basic premise is that what's happening on the internet and what we project on the internet is not reality, really. Like it's a reality, but the ability to edit yourself or to filter yourself, just like Instagram. We always got to put a filter on because it never looks just right. So you're always putting forth what you perceive to be the best part of yourself or what you want people to see, as opposed to actually being yourself. Or any kind of interactions that are happening on the internet are not. They're not in real time, although we think they are, because I can edit my posts, right? And I can rethink what I just said to Father Andrew, right? So he doesn't get angry at me or something like that, right? So that's part of understanding that, yes, it's there, it's a tool, but it should not be mistaken with with the actual object, which is Christ, right? So, or the spiritual life, right? Some people get so caught up with the internet they think it's actually life, right? That's the locus where I will actually interact with my fellow Orthodox Christians. That's where it becomes the actual destination, as opposed to being the tool to get you to go to church, right? So one thing that I try to do actively on the internet is the things that I post, beyond just being authentic or putting parts of your life on there that are appropriate, is always trying to use it to somehow get people to actually go to church. Mm-hmm. So, promoting actual physical events or things, or physical, or even, things that you do like Lenten challenge. Like I do a Lenten challenge called Hungry for God, which is basically, you're putting it on the internet, but really what it's challenging you to do is to actually go out and help people, and actually have interactions with people, as opposed to staying online just talking about it, right? Yeah. So I think that's one of the ways that we need to kind of push people, use the internet as a way of bringing them back to Christ and real interactions and back to their church, or ask your priest, like redirecting them always back to a physical place and real interactions, as opposed to kind of living in this kind of virtual world where you're really not yourself. You're just an avatar of yourself. Yeah. Right. So a lot of people don't know you. They know the Father Andrew Damick that is, you can be as authentic as you can be, but some people will just perceive one aspect of you. Right. So. But you do a good job, because I think you're exactly like I thought you were going to be. So,
well, even when we're in person, we are still being avatars in one way or another. Becoming unfractured and whole is what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish as Christians. So, thanks, Father.
Thanks. Yeah, I got to jump up now. Thanks, Father. This is really helpful, and I have a question that I'm going to try to articulate helpfully, which percolated more out of the first, I guess, half of your presentation. And I was thinking, especially when you were reflecting on the number of voices that are out there now online. And it's interesting to me, because my impression anyway is that it's a disproportionately loud online presence in Orthodoxy, because like with the census that was recently done by the Assembly, there's like 800,000 or 900,000 of us in the U.S. or whatever it is, right? But there's like so many of us, it seems like, active online and commenting and posting and so forth. So I think you made a lot of interesting points, and I thought a lot of helpful sort of principles and guides to keep in mind to make sure that we don't use social media to mistakenly present the faith or sort of mislead people. But I wonder if in the same way, the way that we've been using social media is a tool for diagnosis, and the fact that we talk about it so much online is because we've we've turned the faith into an academic thing, we've turned the faith into a thing to talk about, we've turned the faith into sort of an object of historical inquiry, and like all of these mistakes that we've been making in the real world for so long are now manifesting themselves in the way that we do social media. So maybe like it's potentially a way to diagnose stuff that we've been getting wrong on the parish and whatever level in the first place. So I don't know. It's a thought. Do you have any thoughts about that?
It is certainly the case. Well, let me back up before I begin that sentence and give you a different one. There you go, self-editing, right? Now I've forgotten the first sentence I was going to tell you, but whatever. So it is certainly the case that a lot of the foibles of orthodoxy in the way that it actually exists currently in the world are becoming very manifest online. Now I remembered the first sentence, which was this. The Orthodox Church, I believe, if you've read anything I've ever written, you know this. I believe the Orthodox Church is the one church founded by Jesus Christ, and so on and so forth. But the way that Orthodox people actually exist is something imperfect, right? So what has been revealed by our connectivity, which has taken the world by storm and the church, I think, by surprise, is that our differences have been manifested and revealed. And some of our differences that should not be differences. And just to give you a microcosm of this, are you all aware of the big event that is supposed to be happening in about a week? The Great and Holy Council of the Orthodox Church. 14 Orthodox churches coming together. And now, as of today, I believe I have heard that 5 have decided to pull out or are strongly threatening to. So, we're watching this in real time. This essentially illustrates for us the fact that because of the way that historical contingencies have played themselves out over the last several centuries, most of the churches of Orthodoxy have begun to exist as though they were the church in themselves, because they simply had never had to deal with anybody else. They just didn't. And so as a result, when they're now suddenly coming to the table, they're kind of looking at each other, and even though the stuff that really truly matters the most is still miraculously the same, to me, this is one of the indications that Orthodoxy is the true church, that somehow the Holy Spirit keeps this core dogma intact, even though we're so messed up. To me, well, it must be the true church. Because look how terrible we are at it, they're coming to the table, but these are serious questions they're asking. Not that these things aren't important. They're not dogma issues, but they're serious questions that they're asking, and that there are radically different views on how these things can go. On the one hand, for instance, you have a country where just about everybody is Orthodox, and all the non-Orthodox that come into the country are largely attempting to pooch the Orthodox. So what kind of view are you going to have of non-Orthodox Christians if that's your whole experience of them? Are your sons and daughters allowed to marry them? So on and so forth. That's one situation. Another situation is a place where all of the Christians intermarry, sometimes intermarry with non-Christians, and the Christians feel completely hemmed in by a very non-Christian world. And so that's a different experience of what it means to interact with the non-Orthodox, right? So you can, if you're really good at this stuff, you can tell in your minds, you know which countries and areas I'm talking about. But and I didn't even mention America. I think that our connectivity has revealed our weakness. And you know what? Thank God. Thank God. I sometimes tell people who are getting married or have just been married for a year or so, whatever, when they start to notice that they're fighting all the time or whatever, I'll say, "Great, it's working." What? I said, well, the whole point of this was to reveal your sins so that you could repent of them. So I have no idea whether there's going to be a big council next week. But I do know that our weaknesses are being revealed. And part of why that's possible is that the connectivity that we now have. And the church is in the process. And I think that maybe what we're doing here this weekend is a little piece of this. The church is in the process of coming to terms with what modernity means. Doesn't mean we have to modernize the Orthodox faith, capital O, capital F. We don't. But we do need to ask some serious and deep questions about exactly how we preach the gospel and how we teach it to our children and to our catechumens and to the world. Because largely the situation that exists right now is that the average Orthodox Christian is uncatechized. And the average non-Orthodox Christian has never heard of us. So that's where we actually really are. You know, I sometimes ask people, you know, if you were to go around your parish to any parishioner and say, what is the gospel? That would be a very sad day, the kind of responses that you would get, I think. So, but this is good. It's all being revealed now. So now we can actually engage on those fronts and talk about them openly and deal with reality. You know, even though I don't see Orthodox media as having the same kind of function that the press does in a democracy, right? There's a certain sense in which we're helping with that by just simply saying, here's what's going on. What are we going to do about that? So I hope that makes some level of sense to you. Does that answer your question?
If there was a like button, I would press it. Thank you.